Hi, my name is Eskil. I'm here to present this PowerPoint and share what I learned on this research paper, a study of SSD reliability and large-scale enterprise storage developments. The purpose of this research is to reflect the transitions in technologies today. As the world transitions from hard disks to solid-state drives, the world is still in need of thorough research across SSD implementation reliability. It does so by exploring SSD usage in enterprise storage systems, which uses the RAID architecture, the RAID model that we studied in class. Disk failures were studied as reasons for disk replacements and were analyzed, judged, and described. Disk replacements is really the whole portion of this paper. Why are disks being replaced? How can we prevent it? That's such a thing. A total of 9 findings were reported, and those are what we're going to look at today. So here is some useful terminology and vocabulary that would hopefully put this paper into perspective and give you a better idea of what's going on. If you notice, I said this word a few times. Enterprise storage system. What it is basically a company or facility's personal storage solution. These differ from cloud-based database centers like Microsoft Azure or Amazon's AWS who provide third-party storage. These are just specific towards a company or facility. They're interesting because they come with their own set of problems like workloads, firmware revision, drives, and reliability issues. Next is something that we covered in class, redundant array of independent disks, also known as RAID. It's, to put simply, multiple disks in an array to form a single logical unit from a software perspective. These are interesting because they can scale from fast read and write performance to little redundancy, or the other way around, to little read and write speed but high redundancy. And what redundancy means is just simply to have copies of backup data. Next is blocks. These are useful because these are how SSDs are typically evaluated and what portions of the SSDs are viable or not. And what they are is just the smallest accessible unit of an SSD. They consist of several pages, typically 512 kilobytes in size. Annual replacement rate is the metric that is going to be used quite often in this paper to determine how long a SSD typically lasts. Again, it's the metric for analyzing disk reliability, measured by the number of device failures divided by the number of device years. Next is the program erase cycle, which is also known as PE cycle, which is when an SSD memory is wiped clean and rewritten. These typically dictate how long an SSD is supposed to last, but as we learn in the future, that's not always the case. So here are some of the big picture statistics that the paper initially presents. First, the annual replacement rate for SSDs in enterprise storage systems is around this range, 0.07% to 1.2%. It vastly outperforms the large data center drives, whose range is 1 to 2.5%. If you notice, the upper end of enterprise storage systems is around the lower end of enterprise storage systems. This says that SSDs tend to live happier lives and need less replacement in enterprise storage systems. And the average right here is 0.22%. Additionally, SSDs really outperform hard disk drives, which is 2 to 9%. Though disks can be almost homogeneous, their ARRs, their annual replacement rates, could vary drastically. This is important because this merits further study, right? If one model was the best out of all of them, then every enterprise should just pick that model, right? But that's not necessarily the case. Here's some more vocabulary. Spare blocks are blocks that have been set aside to replace blocks that have failed, are rarely ever used, only used up to a 33% in worst case scenarios. Next, a device program erasable limit is hardly ever reached. What a program erasable limit is how many cycles of the device is expected to have. So PE cycles the device is expected to have. So typically it could range from like 10,000 PE cycles or so. So its memory could be erased and rewritten about 10,000 times. An SSD only makes it up to a third of its program erasable limit on a usual case. This paper ranked the severity of replacements on a scale from A to D, where A was the most severe and D was the least severe. In the worst case scenario, a disk failure of level A would have to completely replace the disk or the array. So that's not wanted. And on the best case scenario, the disk replacement would just involve copying the data from the disk as if it was still operational. So the first finding is that roughly 1/3 of all disk replacements was of the A category, which is not good because that disk is completely gone. But fortunately, at least 1/3 of all disk replacements was of the D category, meaning that these failures were preventable using prediction methods, so data could be retained. So this slide is all about infant mortality. Before that, I want to explain what rate of life is. It's the fraction of PE cycles that the SSD has gone through over the total number of expected PE cycles. So if a SSD has gone through 3,000 PE cycles and it's expected to have 1,000, then its rated life cycle is about 30%. But what infant mortality is the idea the SSD failure rates are greater as they're first deployed. The second finding of this paper, SSDs tend to have quite a long infant mortality period, typically spending 20 to 40% of its life in this state. Most write failures typically occur within the first 1% of SSD's rated life, and the occurrence of write failures decreases as SSDs go throughout its life. So what this is trying to say is that as an SSD goes throughout its life, if it's on the x-axis and the y-axis has the replacement rate, or the errors, more errors are likely to happen early, and as it goes throughout its life, less errors happen. Its infant mortality rate would be like around here. Here we mentioned the types of drives that were used, single cell or multi-level cell. The question is, does the type of flash have an impact on the device's longevity? The answer was no. The type of drive really has little to no impact. It's more likely that other factors such as the device's capacity or lithography would have much higher effect on the device's replacement. Which really brings us into our next point, the implications of the drive's capacity. For drives with capacity under 1.6 terabytes, there was no direct correlation between capacity and replacement rate, but after it hit that 1.6 terabyte threshold, this trend, their next finding, really takes into place, which is the fact that larger drive capacities correlates with higher replacement rates, more severe failures, and less preventable failures. So larger drive capacity really has a big impact on the problem that the drive can have, and typically can denote the drive is more likely to have problems in the future. Next, we take a look at lithography, which is basically just die density. It was interesting to note that lithography is correlated with this type of error, raw bit error rate. It wasn't directly correlated with the replacement rate. So these two are quite exclusive of each other, and they knew this because they had some types of drives who had higher replacement rates at smaller lithography, but other drives that had a lower replacement rate at smaller lithography. So they didn't seem to show any exact correlation. So now we take a step away from the SSD's hardware and take a look at their firmware. And we do notice that there's a significant correlation here, where earlier firmware versions tend to have a much higher annual replacement rate. So drives that were not updated and left in earlier versions were much more susceptible to failures and replacement. They assumed that this is probably because bugs got resolved in updates, and the longer the SSDs were left in previous firmware versions, the more likely they would come across these bugs. If you remember, blocks are the smallest accessible unit for an SSD, and what bad blocks are sections of SSDs that have gone bad and can no longer operate successfully. They found two findings here. The first of which is that SSDs that have at least one bad block are at greater risk to develop other problems and are more susceptible to getting replaced. So the moment an SSD has its first bad block, it's likely to get replaced in the future with more errors. And the second finding is that has to do with over-provisioning, which is a feature that SSDs has to use additional capacity for data. And SSDs that make more use of their over-provisioning are more likely to be replaced. So here we take a look at follow-up failures in a single RAID group. And what a follow-up failure is if you take a look at our RAID, right, and where these are the SSDs, and one of them fails, right, what is the likelihood of another one failing? And it turns out the likelihood is pretty high, at 180 times more likely. The reason for this is because if an SSD fails, the other SSDs in a RAID have the workload of reconstructing the data of the old drive onto the new one. And the interesting part here is that though larger RAID groups are more likely to have one of these devices replaced, right, obviously because there's more SSDs in the group, the trend of having a follow-up replacement is static among RAID group sizes. So independent of RAID group size, this follow-up failure is consistent, which goes to show that companies or enterprises or however could make their RAID groups as large as they want and not have to worry of this failure rate increasing. So here are some of the major takeaways from this paper. This paper does not focus on device failures, but on how those failures attribute to device replacements. Firmware revisions are very important. Make sure to keep those SSDs up to the most recent firmware version. RAID group size really doesn't have an effect on follow-up failures. Disk capacity does have a high correlation with higher replacement rate. SSDs are more likely to have failures early in their related life, right? Infant mortality. And flash type is not important when considering annual replacement rate. Not as much as lithography for specific type of SSDs and capacity.